I'll spare you an account of my joint pain, but especially after having to get my 10,000 steps just walking from my room to the elevator on my floor. I've never seen anything like it, but it's all good for us. It's the privilege of my life. For 35 years I've worked with gang members in Los Angeles. The day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than the thousands of men and women I've been privileged to walk with. People like Luis Perez, who was worked for us for like 10 years, a gang member, tattooed, was in prison, shot caller from his gang, a heroin addict in recovery. And he was quite the speaker. You know, he was always getting invited to speak at high schools. Mainly, they'd ask for him by name. He was quite good and inhabited that role. He and I went out to dinner, and he decided to give me tips on how to speak publicly. So he says, you gotta pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. And I said, yeah, no shit, that is good advice. Good advice there. So that's just my way of saying brace yourselves. So. You know what Martin Luther King says about church could well be said about your time here at the Movement is Life Caucus meeting. It's not the place you've come to, it's always going to be the place you go from. And you go from here to imagine something different. You go from here to imagine a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? How do we imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? How do we go from this place to really choose with a huge dose of intentionality the dismantling of the barriers that exclude? How do we go from this place and really try to situate ourselves at the margins? Because the only way the margins get erased is if we choose to stand out at them. And so we stand with a particularity. We stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and we stand with those whose dignity has been denied, and we stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while, we get this extraordinary, exquisite privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and to stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. No kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no equality. No matter how singularly focused we may well be on those worthy goals, the truth of the matter is they can't happen unless there's some undergirding sense that we are connected and belong to each other. And so we go to the margins, and indeed we brace ourselves because folks will accuse us of wasting our time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. So you go to the margins and suddenly other voices get heard. You know, thousands and thousands of homies have come through our doors at Homeboy Industries, and at any given time we have 500 who are working there. All the others come to receive services and such. All of them are used to being watched, but very few of them are used to being seen. Talking with the great Dr. White over here and about his book, Seeing the Patient. It is about seeing people and then returning them to themselves. You know, a great many Buddhist texts begin with the line, "O nobly born, remember who you really are," which reminds me of the Christmas carol, "Long lay the world in sin and error pining till he appeared and the soul felt its worth." yeah, it's about Jesus, and yeah, it's about Christmas, but how is it not the job description of each one of you? You appear, the soul feels its worth. Exactly right. Otherwise, it's hard for people to inhabit fully their own dignity and truth, that they are exactly what God had in mind when God made them, unless people choose to see them. If I could do a little parenthesis here. Not all that long ago, I buried my 92-year-old mama. She had 8 kids, 5 girls, 3 boys. I buried my father like 25 years ago. And she died as all of us would want to, in your own home, in your own bed, surrounded by your kids. And she was as smart as a tack, even to the very end. In fact, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she wasn't a lick afraid of dying. In fact, a month before she died, she said to me with exhilaration, "I've never done this before," which was like something you might say just before skydiving. And in fact, the day before she died, I happened to be all alone sitting there by her bed, and she was asleep. When she woke up, she looked at me and she said, "Oh, for crying out loud." And well, she was pissed that she hadn't died, and sorry. But the very next day, I happened again to be the only one there, which rarely, never happened. It was exactly noon, and she was asleep, and she opens her eyes, and she lets out this glorious, tiniest, wondrous gasp. Skydiving. And then she left us. And nobody in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. But I mention all this for this. In the last couple months of her life, she'd be in and out of consciousness, and her kids would be there, 2, 3, all 8 of us. And when she would come to, she would lock onto one of us. And she would say with breathless delight, "You're here, you're here." And every human being just wants to be seen, so that the soul can feel its worth, so that you can fully inhabit your own dignity and unshakable goodness. And it's hard to see it unless people are looking you in the eye and saying, "You're here, you're here." Seeing the patient. And we're all called to go from this place to create a community of kinship, a place where there is no us and them, there's just us. And the homies have taught me about kinship in a way that's just palpable, and they've taught me everything of value. But in the last few years, they've taught me how to text, and I'm so grateful to them, because I find it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people. And I'm pretty good at it, LOL and OMG and BTW. And the homies have taught me a new one, OHN, which apparently stands for, "Oh, hell no." And I've been using that one quite a bit lately. And I'm sure I'm not alone in hating this autocorrect thing, So I had a homegirl, a tough cookie named Bertha, drug dealer, gang member, been to prison. So she texts me on a Sunday, "Where are you at?" So I text her back, "I am about to speak to a room full of monjas." And monjas in Spanish are nuns, sisters, religious women. "I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas." I pushed send, and autocorrect told her that I was about to speak to a room full of ninjas, which she thought was pretty darn interesting. Even now, I've been on the road quite a bit, and the homies are constantly, their hair is on fire, and I'm the priest they mistook for an ATM machine. And so they're always, my light bill and my car note, and oh my gosh. And a homie wrote me and he said, "I just need $100 to completar mi renta, to finish off my rent." And I just didn't have it. So I wrote back simply, "Things are tight." And I pushed send, and autocorrect told him, "Thongs are tight." And he wrote me back, "Sorry to hear that. What about my rent?" So So there I am in a car with two older vatos, Manuel and Poncho, and they're older homies who work at Homeboy, and they're going to help me give a talk at a high school in Palm Desert. So we have morning meeting where we all gather in the reception area, and hundreds of us, and we do a prayer and a thought for the day and announcements and sing happy birthday. So we're in the car, Manuel's in the front seat, Poncho's in the back, and we're 15 minutes on the road when Manuel gets an incoming, and he reads the text, and he chuckles to himself. And I said, well, what is it? Oh, it's dumb. It's from Snoopy back at the office. Well, I just seen Snoopy. Snoopy gave me a big abrazo as the day was beginning. Snoopy and Manuel work together in the clock-in room where they clock in hundreds and hundreds of our workers. I would not want this job because this may come as a surprise to you, but occasionally gang members can be attitudinal. So I said, well, what's he say? And he goes, oh, it's dumb. Hang on, let me find it. Here it is. Hey, dog, it's me, Snoops. Yeah, they got my ass locked up at county jail. They're charging me with being the ugliest vato in America. You have to come down right now, show them they got the wrong guy. Well, I nearly drove in oncoming traffic. We laughed so damn hard, the three of us. And then I realized that Manuel and Snoopy are enemies. They're rival gang members. They used to shoot bullets at each other, because I remember. Now they shoot text messages. And there's a word for that, and the word is kinship. How do we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate? So Homeboy Industries was started a long time ago, in 1988, when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of LA, nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens, Aliso Village, largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war in my parish in the projects, which is unheard of in public housing to have that many, making it, according to the LAPD, the highest place of the highest concentration of gang activity in all of Los Angeles. So if LA is the gang capital of the world, my parish was the gang capital of Los Angeles. There are 120,000 gang members in LA County and 1,100 gangs. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and I buried my 231st 2 weeks ago. Not all from that community, of course, but I run a large gang intervention program, so I get asked to do this. So for the first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many middle school, junior high age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. So they were wreaking havoc in the projects in the middle of the day, writing on walls, selling drugs, violent. And so I walked out to them, and I would kind of isolate them and kind of pull them away from the group and ask, hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And to my surprise, every single one said, yeah, I would. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so I right across the street from our church is our parochial school, grades K to 8, occupying the first 2 floors. But the entire 3rd floor was the convent where the ninjas lived. And so I gathered all the nuns together one evening in their living room. I sat them down. I said, hey, would you guys mind, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members. And they looked at each other and they said, sure. And that was the entirety of their discernment process. And so we were off and running, and gang members came in large numbers to the church, to our property anyway, which created a disconnect. People in the parish would sidle up to me and say, hey, wait a minute, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? Good people in and bad people out, which I thought was a good gospel challenge. And then the homie said, if only we had jobs. And so myself and the women in the parish, we marched around there are only women in the parish, because it was women and children who lived in the projects. We marched around the factories that surrounded the housing projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we started things, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of rival enemy gang members from the 8 gangs in the projects. And then, as some of you may recall, that in 1992, after the Rodney King verdict, every pocket of poverty exploded in Los Angeles, except the poorest pocket, my parish, didn't. And so the LA Times wanted to know why that was. So they asked me, and I said, well, I don't know, maybe it was because we had 60 strategically hired rival enemy gang members who were working with their enemies. And they had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community. So the article appeared the next day. Well, the following day, I get summoned by a man named Ray Stark, who was a movie producer in Hollywood, and he happened to have $500 million. So he summoned me to his Beverly Hills office, and he said, how do you think I should spend my money? As I look back on it now, I see that I woefully undershot my request, but I was young. So I said, well, there's an abandoned bakery across the street from our school, and it's got ovens. They don't work, but you could buy the place and fix the ovens, and we could put hairnets on enemy rival gang members. I don't know. They could bake bread. We could call it Homeboy Bakery. That was the extent of my business plan. And he said, sure. So we were off and running. And a month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, we changed our previous name, which was Jobs for a Future, to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this venture. Not everything worked, I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And now nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but we backed our way, we evolved our way. Now we're the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on the planet. So 15,000 folks a year. Walk through our doors trying to reimagine their lives. They all come in with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was frightening or frightened, and you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. They all come from a place of despondency where they couldn't imagine a future for themselves. They all come from a place of enormous trauma and damage, so they have a hard time finding their way to transform their pain, so they just kept inflicting it. And a lot of them carry mental health issues that are quite pronounced and debilitating. And they find rest. They find some safe place to take off the backpacks filled with chronic toxic stress. I recommend a great book called The Deepest Well. I'm blanking out on her name. Nadine Burke-Harris, I think her name. She's the first Surgeon General in the state of California, and she talks about the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And she says that, if a kid is like 4 or 5 on the 10 scale, boy, that's beware, this kid's going to have some health issues, to say nothing of socializing issues. But every gang member who walks through our doors is a 9 or 10 on the ACEs scale. I'm a 0, which doesn't make me morally superior to the thousands of folks I'm privileged to walk with. So they come in, though we used to be job-centric, now we're healing-centered. Our proposition is this: an employed gang member may or may not return to prison, and an educated one may or may not, but it is our guarantee that a healed gang member will not ever reoffend, period. And so far, so good. So once they find this experience of being cherished in a community of tenderness, then they can find their way clear to arrive at the joy there is in cherishing others. And so they find Homeboy as a sanctuary, and then they become that sanctuary that they sought, and then they go home and provide that sanctuary to their kids, and suddenly you've broken a cycle. So we have, as was mentioned, we have 4 paid therapists, 47 volunteer therapists, including 2 psychiatrists. We have case managers, navigators, lots of classes, free tattoo removal. No place removes more tattoos than we do. A designated clinic, 1 paid physician assistant, 3 laser machines, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, tattoo removal, 43 volunteer doctors who help. And it all was started because of a guy named Frank who wandered into my office. I didn't know him. 2 days released out of Corcoran State Prison. And he's sitting in front of my desk, and tattooed on his forehead in big, huge block black letters, it said, "Fuck the world." And he looked at me and he said, "You know, I am having a hard time finding a job." And I say, "Well, you know, Frank, maybe, I don't know, we could put our heads together on this one, you know." And so I didn't know where I could send him, you know, like to McDonald's. "Do you want fries with that?" "No, I don't want fries." So naturally, I hired him, and he bagged bread for a time at our bakery. And then I went looking for a doc, and I found a dermatologist with a laser machine at White Memorial Hospital. He agreed to give me 1 hour a month to chip away at Frank's forehead and like 4 other guys. In no time at all, I had a waiting list of 3,000 gang members who wanted this same treatment, so we couldn't really stay with that arrangement. Parentheses, Frank is currently a security guard at a movie studio in Hollywood, and there is no trace left of the angriest, dumbest thing he had ever done, proving once and for all that all of us are a whole lot more than the worst things we've ever done. And then we have all our training programs in social enterprises, solar panel installation training, Homeboy Bakery, Homeboy Silkscreen, Homeboy Homegrown Merchandise, where we sell our logo stuff, Homeboy Recycling, electronic waste recycling. We have a diner at City Hall, the only place you can get food at City Hall, as was Ramon mentioned, a restaurant at LAX, Terminal 4, American Airlines. We have a thing called Homeboy Grocery, where we sell chips, salsa, and guacamole on both coasts. On this coast, in all the Stop and Shops in 5 states, and Walmart on the other coast. Homeboy Farmers Markets. And Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. And they cater. I invite you to go there. It'll be kind of a who's who experience. A lot of movie stars and electeds. Jim Carrey goes there quite a bit, and Jack Black and Forrest Whitaker. And once, with 2 hours notice from the Secret Service, Vice President Joe Biden showed up. He wanted to have lunch at the famous Homegirl Cafe when he was vice president. So it was motorcade and selfies with Uncle Joe. And then most famously of all, Diane Keaton came once, Oscar winner, movie star, Annie Hall, Godfather movies. Her waitress is Glinda, and Glinda's a big girl, been there, done that, tattooed, felon, parolee, gang member. She has no idea who Diane Keaton is, and so she's taking her order, and Diane Keaton says, "Well, what do you recommend?" And Glinda rattles off the 3 dishes she particularly likes, and Diane Keaton says, "Well, I'll have that second one. That one sounds really good." And it's at that moment something dawns on Glinda. She looks at Diane Keaton and she says, "Wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere. You know, like maybe we've met." And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly. "Oh, gosh, I don't know. I suppose I have one of those faces that people think they've seen before. And then Glenda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Yeah, well, that just took my breath away, and I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, or as Jesus says, that you may be one. People are used to being watched. They're not used to being seen. Oh, nobly born, remember who you really are. You're here. You're here. And the soul feels its worth. This conference is not the place you've come to. It's the place you go from. And you go from here to choose to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love, return people to themselves. We're really allergic at Homeboy to holding the bar up and asking gang members to measure up. We don't like doing it. We just hold the mirror up and tell people, here's who you are, oh nobly born. And the soul feels its worth. But you have to reach in and you have to dismantle messages of shame and disgrace that keep people from seeing their truth. For every gang member comes into our place barricaded behind a wall of shame. And only tenderness can scale that wall. In the Acts of the Apostles, they have an odd line that sort of leaps out at you, and it says simply, and awe came upon everyone. And it seems to suggest that the measure of health in any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So a number of years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. And it was one of those, commandeer a hotel ballroom from 9 to 5, and all these social workers get credit. I've been at these before, where you try to teach things about gangs and stuff. Workshops and breakout sessions and keynotes. So I figured I'd maybe give a keynote, and I said, sure, and I bought my ticket. Well, a week before I was to fly, I pull out the original letter inviting me, and to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day. And I said to myself, oh, hell no. So I invited two homies, trainees, in our 18-month training program, Andre and Jose, and I sit them down in my office, and they're like in their 9th month of their 18 months. And I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time, because we got a long-ass day to fill. So I had never heard their stories, and Jose gets up first, and he's like 25 years old, and a gang member, been to prison, tattooed. But, all the homies go through what we call these phases. So he was in a phase where he had become, in the 18-month program, a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery, and now he's helping and accompanying younger homies and homegirls in their issues with addiction. So a man had been in prison for a time, but he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers did what you did. They audibly gasped. And then he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. I've never seen this. We got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. And then he continued, I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California And she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and the second t-shirt you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he regained his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. For there's an idea that's taken root in the world. It's at the root of all that's wrong with it. And the idea would be this: that there just might be lives out there that matter less than other lives. You go from this conference to stand against that idea. Let me end with this last story, and I'll entertain some questions or comments. It occurs sometimes to universities to force their students to read my books against their will. And I'm not complaining, but so my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, who ruins my bracket every March Madness, forced their incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart. So they said, could you come, and we're going to have a big talk Tuesday night, and it's 1,000 people. And I said, sure. And then they said, could you bring 2 homies with you? And I do if people are going to pay for it. And I always pick homies in the same way. I always pick enemies, rivals among our trainees, just, to force them to share a hotel room, just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. Once I was at LAX with 2 older vatos, and one of them, dead serious, said to me, hey, G, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, well, yeah, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked 2 homies, Bobby, an African-American gang member who at the time worked in the bakery, and Mario, who worked in our little store where we sell insignia stuff. And oh my gosh, I've probably done this 1,000 times with men and women. I've never picked anybody like this guy, Mario. Oh, you expect the homies to be kind of nervous, but this guy was absolutely to the bone, petrified, It was starting to freak me out. He was actually hyperventilating, which I'd never seen anybody do, like that, and we hadn't even boarded the plane yet. And so we're at Burbank Airport, which is kind of a smallish airport, big bay windows, Southwest Airlines, big planes, but they don't have that hermetically sealed chute to board the plane. They have those steps to board. You walk on the tarmac like you're the president, and you walk up those steps to board the front. And the big feature at Burbank are the steps at the back of the plane. So I'm sitting there with Mario. Bobby's exploring the airport. And our plane arrives, it's early morning, and people are deplaning. And I said, Mario, that's going to be our plane. Like this, and I think, wow, he may actually die before we climb those stairs. And so then I see our flight crew arrives, pilots and flight attendants, and 2 female flight attendants. Each of them have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up those steps, the front steps. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? And I said, well, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. So I should tell you that in our 31-year history as an organization, Mario is the most tattooed individual who's ever worked there, which, trust me, is saying a lot. And he's all sleeved out, covered in tattoos to his fingers, head shaved, covered in tattoos, neck blackened from jawbone to collarbone with the name of his gang, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that when he's, I guess, lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody, I guess. So I'd never been in public with him, and so I'm trying to calm him down, and I'm walking him through the airport, and people are literally, oh my God, like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. I'm thinking, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were to go to Homeboy on Monday, walk up to anybody who works there and say, quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here? They won't say me. They'll think for half a second and they'll say, oh, Mario. Yeah, Mario. Mario works in the cafe now. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. Mario is proof that the highest form of spiritual maturity is tenderness. So we get to Gonzaga, and this always happens. You got the big talk Tuesday night. What they don't tell you is that they have 93 other talks planned all damn day. It's like, oh, come on. This class, this lunch, this class, all day. So I tell the 2 of them, look, I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. You get up and tell your stories. Well, they were nervous, especially Mario, but they did a good job. Stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind, and honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So the nighttime talk comes, and I coax them to get up before me to do a little 7-minute each snapshot of their life so that they can join me for the Q&A, and they do, but it's 1,000 people, and Mario's quite terrified, but they did a good job. I did my thing. And then I invite them up to stand on either side and say, yes, ma'am. And a woman stands, and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. So Mario steps up to the microphone, and he's a tall, skinny drink of water, and he clutches the microphone. He's just terrified. Yes. And she says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? Mario closes his eyes, and he clutches the microphone, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say, and he's starting to tremble, but when suddenly he blurts out, as soon as he says those 2 words, he rushes back to his microphone-clutching, closed-eyed refuge. And now I know he's losing the battle with his tears, but he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry, and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had decided to return him to himself. And everyone standing had been returned to themselves. Everyone seeing each other. Oh, nobly born. Remember who you really are, and the soul feels its worth. Everybody saying to each other, you're here. You're here. And we don't go to the margins to make a difference. We go to the margins so that Mario makes us different. But we go to the margins nonetheless, and pretty soon we cease to care if anyone accuses us of wasting our time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much.